She woke up, washed her face, and covered it in shellac. Polyfill in the cracks of her perceived imperfection. Miss Nancy doesn't like emotion or what it does to her face. Tries hard to erase any trace of distinction. God, how can your bitter mouth speak words that taste so sweet? God, I hate your smile, as if we're minions at your feet. I bore a hole straight through to where I guessed your soul would be. But when I cracked you open, I found only a receipt.
I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santa Maria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. I want to start the show off today with a little excerpt from Roger Launius's article titled Nauvoo in Mormon History at the Crossroads of Faith and History. My friend and mentor, Joe Geisner, sent this over, and I can't seem to find this article anywhere in Googling it, so I believe the article itself is actually unpublished, and it kind of reads as a lecture by Roger Launius about the recently published book that he had published, Cultures in Conflict. The quote is absolutely fascinating, and it provides a quick overview of the realm of historical studies concerning Nauvoo Mormonism. He quotes extensively from Robert Bruce Flanders, who is the author of Nauvoo, Kingdom on the Mississippi, that I have cited many, many times. It's an amazing book. Here we go. Quote, Robert Bruce Flanders appropriately concluded in 1973 that, now quoting Flanders, Utah began in Nauvoo, as did the dissenting sects of Mormonism, such as the Reorganized Church, in a different way. He added that Nauvoo was a volatile mixture of elements: American patriotism, immigrant dreams of the promised land, displaced person desperation, religious mysticism and fanaticism, free experimentation with new social, ethical, and politico-economic modes, optimism, opportunism, energy, and escalating violence within and without. Now, Launius concludes that with saying, whether those lessons be positive or negative in conclusion matter not. The compelling factor of seeking an order from the experience makes the issue worth exploring. End quote. Now, that's precisely why we're taking such an inordinate amount of time to get through the Nauvoo era of Mormon history. I mean, look at the backlog of episodes. It took us the sum total of 25 history episodes to cover the cultural milieu of the Smith family and other prominent figures within the early church, and to get through the New York era of Mormonism. Another 15 episodes, and we were through the entire Kirtland era. But as my understanding of Mormon history continues to expand on a daily basis, our analysis has slowed to a crawl. It took another 12 episodes to cover just the single year of 1838 in Missouri. Now, we've spent over 50 episodes on just 3 years of Nauvoo history, and that's only just staring at the tip of the iceberg from a distance. But really, the thing is here, I'm not in a hurry to get anywhere with the historical timeline. I've received messages from people who keep wondering when I'll get to this or that controversial subject in Mormon history, and my most frequent reply is just a few simple words: all in due time. You see, history is complex. We're trying to chart the high points of the journey of thousands of people over 20 years at the moment, and it's no simple task. And that's my way of saying, please sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride as it happens. Don't get ahead of us. It's also my way of saying that I'm steadily working on ideas of exactly how to best create an inclusive narrative that isn't just a podcast about catching up with Joe every week, right? Everything in Mormon history was moved and shaped by Joseph Smith, but it's important to focus on individuals other than him in order to understand the broader context in which Mormonism lived. Today our focus will be on Nancy Rigdon. She was the prized eldest single daughter of church leader Sidney Rigdon and Phoebe Brooks Rigdon, and is reported as being one of the most beautiful young women to grace the church with her presence. She was 8 years old when she was baptized into the church, soon after her mother and father joined. That, of course, came as a result of the first mission troops proselytizing campaign when they stopped in Kirtland, Ohio on their way to the border with the Lamanites, quote-unquote, in Missouri at the end of 1830. Nancy Rigdon met the prophet and elect Lady Emma likely in February or March of 1831 when they first arrived in town during their own private exodus from New York, while the remainder of the New York Saints were amidst preparations to make their journey to the Western Reserve area of Ohio. Nancy was barely 9 years old when she first met the power couple of Mormonism, while Joseph Smith had just turned 26 years old. Nancy matured into becoming the dashing young woman she was, while Joe was her father's best friend throughout the Kirtland era of Mormonism. One of her first adult-like investments was purchasing stock in the Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company around the age of 16 years old. She had been with her parents for every move from Kirtland to Hiram, Ohio, then back to Kirtland, and then she even moved very briefly out to Salem, Massachusetts for a year before the church began its exodus to Missouri, during which time she moved to the church headquarters in Far West Missouri along with her parents, Sidney and Phoebe. In the aftermath of the Missouri Mormon War, Nancy's father, Hingepin Sidney Rigdon, was incarcerated in Liberty Jail. Phoebe, Nancy's mother, Sidney's wife, frequently went to the Liberty Jail in order to care for Sidney while he was in his fragile mental state of mind during this tumultuous period of Mormon history. Nancy was not present for Rigdon's jailbreak, but Phoebe was, and the results impacted Nancy and the rest of the Rigdon family extensively. But Phoebe did help precipitate the occasion of Sidney Rigdon's jailbreak quite effectively. This is from Richard Van Wagner's Sidney Rigdon, A Portrait of Religious Excess, page 255. It's really a fantastic book. Comes highly recommended. Quote, returning to confinement with the rest of his brethren, Rigdon waited 10 days, until 5th of February, for a favorable opportunity to put into effect the escape plan he had masterminded with the assistance of Sheriff Samuel Hadley and jailer Samuel Tillery. A carriage, probably driven by his son-in-law George W. Robinson, was ready, quote, to take me in and carry me of with all speed, end quote, wrote Rigdon. Arrangements had also been made for a guide who was well acquainted with the country, to pilot me through the country so that I might not go on any of the public roads. Phoebe had come to the jail earlier in the day to accompany her husband out of the state to safety in Illinois. When darkness fell, the sheriff and jailer brought supper to their charges. After Sidney and Phoebe had eaten, Rigdon whispered to the jailer to blow out all the candles but one and step away from the door with that one. The sheriff then took him by the arm, and a prearranged scuffle ensued. During the mock shoving match, the sheriff pushed Rigdon out of the door onto the street, then shook his hand and bade him farewell, advising him to make his escape with all possible speed. After sprinting a short distance, Rigdon heard someone running behind him. Thinking his escape had been discovered, he drew his pistol, cocked it, and assumed a defensive posture, determined not to be taken alive. But as his pursuer drew near and spoke, Rigdon recognized it was George W. Robinson. A few moments later, another ally, the guide, arrived with horses. In the rush of adrenaline and confusion of the moment, Rigdon had forgotten his wife in the jail. Robinson returned to get her, while Rigdon and his squire left town as fast as their horses could manage. 3 miles outside town, Robinson and Phoebe, riding in an open carriage, caught up with the horsemen. Phoebe and her son-in-law then drove to Far West to gather their families, while Rigdon and his guide spared no horseflesh racing eastward across Missouri to an anticipated safe haven. At daybreak, Rigdon and his escort arrived at the house of an acquaintance. They slept throughout the day, then rode again under cover of darkness until they reached Tenney's Grove. To their surprise, the Rigdon and Robinson families awaited them, having traveled faster and more public byways. A hiding place was secured in the rear of the wagon, where Rigdon hid during daylight hours as the conveyance rolled easterly. When the travelers reached the western banks of the Mississippi after dark, Rigdon was so apprehensive about remaining in Missouri overnight that he paid 2 canoeists to transport him across the mighty river, where, wrote his son Wycliffe, he, quote, was free from his persecutors and could rest in peace, end quote. Phoebe Rigdon was crucial to the success of this escape, described by Richard Van Wagner. Providing a bit of subterfuge for the other jailers so that they could, to focus on that instead of Sidney's little feigned battle with the sheriff and the other jailer. And then while Sidney made his way to Quincy, Illinois, where all of the Mormons were in the middle of their exodus from Missouri, Phoebe Rigdon and George W. Robinson were responsible for going back to Far West, collecting the rest of the family's stuff and the rest of the family members. And Nancy was part of that. And she must have played an important role in loading up all of her younger siblings and everybody's possessions. She was 16, 17 years old at this time. The Rigdons had, I believe it was 10 children at this time, and all of the logistical encumbrances created a fair amount of demands that all of the kids would have had to contribute, put their shoulder to the wheel. So with the help of Nancy and George W. Robinson, Phoebe Rigdon was able to load up the entire rest of the Rigdon family and their most precious possessions in the family wagon and begin the 170-mile journey eastward towards Quincy. All the while, Hingepin Sidney Rigdon was traveling under the cover of night in order to avoid detection in the state of Missouri. Just like Joseph Smith, if Rigdon was caught by somebody who knew him by his face, Sidney would likely be shot on the spot for his role in the conflict of the preceding year. So Nancy, Phoebe, and the whole Rigdon family made their way to Quincy and eventually briefly put down roots before they all moved to Commerce. During this time, Sidney was so overwhelmed by coordinating logistics of the Mormon exodus from Missouri and then acquiring new land, Phoebe and Nancy would have made up the unified partnership in the Rigdon family for keeping all 9 remaining non-adult children in line during this trying time. Nancy continued to mature in Nauvoo in her late teenagehood, becoming an increasingly desirable prospective wife for some fine Mormon lad in Nauvoo. But as is even the case today, a beautiful young woman in a prominent social position within a community will eventually become a magnet for all sorts of rumors, regardless of her conduct. And such was the case with Nancy Rigdon. Bennett's History of the Saints provides a brief character sketch of Nancy Rigdon. This begins on page 241. Quote, Miss Rigdon is the eldest unmarried daughter of Sidney Rigdon, Esquire, and is a beautiful girl of irreproachable fame, great moral excellence, and superior intellectual endowments. She is a young lady of many charms and varied attractions, but she, too, was marked out for the cloister. Joe could not suffer a pretty woman to escape without a trial. End quote. Understandably, Nancy Rigdon had grown up as a beautiful, attractive, and intelligent young girl under Joseph's predatory gaze since the Rigdons were baptized into the church and the Smith family made their way to Kirtland. Now, in 1842, when she was age 19, something changed, which made it seem like it was the proper time for Joe to, what shall we say, test the waters of Nancy's personal convictions when it comes to monogamy versus polygamy. So Joe set up a meeting between him and Nancy. The intent behind the meeting is well understood to historians today, and I alluded to this scenario last episode, but let's really dive in and try to figure out what happened between Nancy and Joe on that day. The details of how this meeting happened are fascinating. First off, it was set up by Joe's recently acquired plural wife, Marinda Nancy Johnson Hyde. We'll discuss that further in a moment, but Marinda was acting as emissary to Nancy Rigdon to try and soften the blow of Joe's pending proposition to Nancy. This meeting marked a few turning points in Mormon history, and we'll discuss that in a minute here. We're continuing in Van Wagner's biography of Sidney Rigdon. This is on page 294. Quote, Sidney Rigdon's family was likewise drawn into the labyrinth of spiritual wifery on 9th April 1842. At the funeral of young Ephraim R. Marks, Nancy Hyde, wife of Apostle Orson Hyde, gave 19-year-old Nancy Rigdon a message that Joseph wanted to talk with her at the Hyde residence. Nancy Marinda Johnson Hyde, a trusted friend of the Rigdons, was a clandestine facilitator for spiritual wifery, a role she espoused apparently to amend for her husband's 1838 apostasy. The conditions imposed on Orson Hyde to obtain his former standing, according to one account, were to relinquish his money and his wife to Joseph Smith, quote, as a ransom for his transgression, end quote. So, a brief pause here. That is some powerful religious coercion. Orson Hyde had apostatized during the 1838 conflict in Missouri, and in order to be accepted into full fellowship and obtain his former standing, he had to repay Joe and the leadership for his sins. So Joe forced Hyde to give up his money and his wife as a ransom for his transgression. Okay? During this time that Joe took Marinda Nancy Johnson as his plural wife, Orson the Hyden, as we call him, was actually on a mission for the church in Jerusalem. So yes, Joe married other men's wives and did so while those men were on missions, right? The detail that's often lost in that little anti-Mormon punchline is that Joe coerced them both to doing what they did for Joe's benefit as a vengeance and power play, because Orson had gone against the will of the prophet during his time of need in Missouri. Further, Marinda Nancy Johnson became one of those famed mothers in Israel, as they were called. She was one of Joe's wives who would help convince other women that celestial marriage was true and righteous, which created a positive feedback loop of using current plural marriages to gain new plural marriages. Now, everything about the relationships between Marinda Nancy Johnson Hyde and Joseph Smith and Nancy Rigdon and Orson Hyde at this time, it's all pretty disgusting any way you try and cut it. It's a massive power play of religious coercion. And unfortunately, that's not even the most disturbing part of Marinda Nancy Johnson's place in Nauvoo Mormonism. Continuing on in Van Wagner's book on Sidney Rigdon, quote, "On 2nd December 1841, while Orson Hyde was absorbed in his historic mission to the Holy Land, Smith revealed a divine directive ordering church printer Ebenezer Robinson to take Nancy Hyde and her children into his home, the first-floor suite of the Times and Seasons office on the corner of Bain and Water Streets. The revelation concluded, quote, 'Let my handmaid Nancy Marinda Hyde hearken to the counsel of my servant Joseph in all things whatsoever he shall teach unto her, and it shall be a blessing upon her and upon her children after her, unto her justification, saith the Lord.'" Back to Van Wagner. An entry 4 months later in the prophet's personal diary notes that Nancy, that's Nancy Hyde, Nancy Marinda Johnson or Marinda Nancy Johnson Hyde, was sealed to him in April of 1842, one of several relationships contracted with married women during his lifetime. Evidently, Hyde, although sealed to the prophet, was shared with Smith's scribe, Apostle Willard Richards, whose wife was in Massachusetts. Shared, yes, shared. Ebenezer Robinson wrote that in late January 1842, after his family was forced to vacate the printing office, quote, "Willard Richards nailed down the windows and fired off his revolver in the street after dark and commenced living with Mrs. Nancy Marinda Hyde. John C. Bennett, former member of the First Presidency, wrote of Richards, quote, hiding, spelled Hyding, hiding, and Mrs. Hyde and Dr. Richards residing at the printing office, quote, on special business, end quote." So another brief pause here. Yeah, when you were on Joe's good side, like Whiteout Willard Richards, you get all of the perks of the job. If your husband is on Joe's bad side, like Marinda Nancy Johnson's was, Orson Hyde, Joe used you as a commodity to award the people who were on his good side. Everything in Nauvoo had a price, especially women. Quote, Sidney Rigdon, later commenting on Hyde's and Richards' illicit relationship, exclaimed in an 1845 letter, now quoting Sidney Rigdon, "If Richards should take a notion to Hyde's wife in his absence, all that is necessary to be done is to be sealed. No harm done, no adultery committed, only taking a little advantage of rights of priesthood. And after Richards has gone the round of dissipation with Hyde's wife, she is afterwards turned over to Smith, and thus the poor silly woman becomes the actual dupe of two designing men, under the sanctimonious garb of rights of the royal priesthood." Back to Van Wagner. In April 1842, however, the Rigdon family knew nothing of Apostle Richards and Nancy Hyde's relationship. Thus, Nancy Rigdon had no qualms about meeting Joseph Smith at the Hyde residence with Sister Hyde as chaperone. On arriving at the printing office, Willard Richards informed her that Joseph was detained elsewhere and wished her to return the following Thursday. In the meantime, she discussed the situation with Francis M. Higbee, Forewarned by John C. Bennett that Smith had confided to him a romantic interest in Nancy, cautioned her, quote, this is quoting John C. Bennett, not to place too much reliance on revelation, but did not counsel her against going, end quote. Another brief pause here. Late April of 1842, Reckitt Bennett and Joe's relationship was really fracturing. So here we have John C. Bennett advising Nancy Rigdon that Joe was going to propose to her, but John Bennett didn't tell her not to go. He just said, don't put too much reliance on revelation. If we're looking for some of the causes as to why Reckitt Bennett and Joe had such a volcanic and immediate breakup, cock-blocking kind of explains a lot, doesn't it? Now to continue the interaction between Joe and Nancy Rigdon. This was a meeting, once again, set up by Marinda Nancy Johnson Hyde, who was a mother in Israel and a polygamous wife of Joseph Smith. Quote, the various accounts of Nancy's second visit to the printing office are convoluted. The general consensus, however, is that upon her arrival, Smith greeted her in, ushered her into a private room, then locked the door. Protect LDS children, people. After swearing her to secrecy, wrote George W. Robinson, Smith announced his affection for her for several years, and wished that she should be his. The Lord was well pleased with this matter. There was no sin in it whatever. But if she had any scruples of conscience about the matter, he would marry her privately. But Nancy, a buxom and winsome girl, according to one account, was not cooperative. Despite her tender age, she did not hesitate to express herself. The prophet's seductive behavior shocked her. She rebuffed him in a flurry of anger. Wycliffe Rigdon wrote that Smith, flustered, beckoned Mrs. Hyde into the room to help win Nancy over. Hyde volunteered that she too was surprised upon first hearing the tenet, but was convinced it was true, and that great exaltation would come to those who received and embraced it. Incredulous, the feisty Nancy countered that if she ever got married, she would marry a single man or none at all. Grabbing her bonnet, she ordered the door opened or she would raise the neighbors. She then stormed out of the Hyde-Richards residence. End quote. Now, I should point out here, Nancy became a vitriolic opponent of Mormonism after Joe's death. She didn't really continue belief in the Book of Mormon or in Rigdonism, the religion that her father organized after Smith's death. She was a smart and free-spirited woman whose morality stood above her contemporary religious leaders. Her sense of morality wouldn't be swayed by those wolves in shepherd's clothing. It should also be noted that it becomes even more salacious when we see Joe's continued pursuit of Nancy Rigdon. This all culminated in a confrontation between Rigdon and Joe, but prior to said confrontation, Joe continued to accost Nancy. He sent a letter with Whiteout Willard Richards to give to Nancy, but the wording reveals his self-aggrandizing motives in the purest form. He decided to, this is going to baffle you, he decided to leverage language used by Sidney Rigdon a week prior during Ephraim Marx's funeral to make his point to Nancy that there was nothing wrong with polygamy. Now, to review, Sidney Rigdon gave this sermon at Ephraim Marx's funeral, where Marinda Nancy Johnson initially gave her the note that Joseph wanted to meet with her. And now he is using language from that sermon to justify polygamy. Here we go. Quote, within a day or two, Willard Richards delivered a private letter to Nancy. The prophet, as was his custom, had dictated the personal communication through his scribe. The essence of that message made an intriguing appendage to Sidney Rigdon's 9th April Ephraim Marx funeral sermon. According to observer Wilford Woodruff, President Rigdon took as his text, quote, when we see a principle that makes us the most happy, if we will cultivate that principle and practice it ourselves, it will render others happy. Back to Van Wagner. The prophet, who habitually used language as much to conceal as he did to express, began his letter to Nancy with a cheerful assertion, quote, happiness is the object and design of our existence. After a brief discussion on keeping the commandments, the message cut to the chase. Now quoting from this letter. That which is wrong under one circumstance may be and often is right under another. Everything that God gives us is lawful and right, and it is proper that we should enjoy his gifts and blessings. Blessings offered but rejected are no longer blessings. Our Heavenly Father is more liberal in his views and boundless in his mercies and blessings than we are ready to believe or receive. Back to Van Wagner. Citing God, Smith further declared, "No good thing will I withhold from them who will listen to my voice and to the voice of my servant whom I have sent, for I delight in those who seek diligently to know my precepts and abide by the laws of my kingdom. For all things shall be made known unto them in mine own due time, and in the end they shall have joy." End quote. So, not only did Joe use Sidney Rigdon's own words to try and get Sidney Rigdon's daughter, Nancy, to marry him, but those words were taken from a funeral sermon from a week prior. Now, I don't know what low is, but that feels like it's about as low as it gets for a human being, right? That's just straight up deplorable. Now, really quickly, I want to draw a line of clarification that I've drawn before, but it bears repeating to articulate why this is deplorable in my perspective. I have no problem with 2 or 3 or even 1,000 informed consenting adults doing whatever they want in their respective intimate settings. Okay? What informed consenting adults do behind closed doors is none of my business and has absolutely no bearing on who they are as human beings. It simply doesn't matter. I have no problem with any form of monogamous or polygamous or polyandrous relationship, whatever polyamorous, relationship, as long as those 3 criteria are filled. Informed, consenting adults. Just be honest and respectful with your partner or partners and don't violate trust by violating the terms of agreement in a relationship. Also, don't hold to specific views and preach about them in public when your private life is exactly counter to what you preach. That's hypocrisy. It's lying. It's dishonest. And any person whose conduct is exactly what their moral prescriptions are proclaimed in public, they're a liar and a hypocrite, deserving of universal derision. When you have to justify your morality with divinely inspired moral relativism with lines like, "That which is wrong under one circumstance often is right under another," and those circumstances are merely contingent upon who you're trying to have sex with at that given moment, you've lost your moral compass long before arriving at that moment. Everything in this interaction between Joe and Nancy violates everything that I've described at some level. Joe publicly preached strict monogamy from the pulpit repeatedly throughout his entire ministry while hypocritically practicing polygamy behind closed doors. Those polygamous relationships violated the terms of Joe and Emma's relationship agreements, which were wholly shaped by the time and place from which they both came. Joe was using his position in the community to coerce Nancy Rigdon into the relationship, but she was too strong-willed to listen to his bovine feces, whereas Marinda Nancy Johnson Hyde's role in Mormon polygamy is a perfect example of what happens when a person doesn't have the fortitude of will to oppose the proclamations of the prophet, who was using his religious and social position to influence people for his own gain. Further, Nancy Rigdon was not openly informed by Joe the extent of what she'd be getting into should she have agreed to the marriage. It took an enemy of Joseph Smith's, that's Reckitt Bennett, to inform Nancy Rigdon of what was going on, so when she went into the meeting, she already had her mind fortified and ready to go against the prophet's incessant pleadings to take her to wife. Now, Nancy was an adult, but there are multiple examples where Joe violated the third prong of that informed consenting adults equation repeatedly. Joe was a predator, he was a liar, and a hypocrite. And honestly, I'm glad that I don't believe in the church anymore, because knowing the facts surrounding this whole situation, I could not reconcile this as a believer. If I was a believer and in Joseph Smith as a prophet of God, knowing all of these circumstances and the cultural context of Nancy Rigdon and Joseph Smith, that's a truth that I could not bring into reconciliation. I don't know how anybody who knows these circumstances can hold to the ideology that Joseph Smith was a moral human being, much less a pious prophet of the Holy Lord, right? It simply doesn't compute. But luckily, I don't have to bring those concepts into accordance with each other. I don't have to justify his behavior. I simply pity anybody who does, and at some level admire the plasticity of their mind to be able to mold into such fantastic gymnastics that seem so bafflingly counter to simple logic. If only those people put those mental gymnastic abilities to useful causes. But another aspect that's revealed in this whole Nancy Rigdon issue is just how it further drove a wedge between Joe's relationships with previously trusted Mormon elites. Not only did Bennett warning Nancy before her meeting with Joe reveal that his and Joe's relationship was quickly waning in strength and trust, but it served to almost completely dissolve his relationship with Hingepin Sidney and Phoebe Rigdon. The Rigdons and the Smiths had been close friends for over a decade by this point. They'd been through thick and thin together. They faced mobs, been driven from state to state. Joe and Sidney had stood on the witness stand in court together. Both families had helped raise each other's children. Both families had been driven hopelessly in debt together. But Joe's reach in polygamy was too vast. It was only a matter of time before his polygamous practices affected the Rigdons as well. Now, Wideout Willard Richards delivering Joe's letter to Nancy, to add more cultural context into this, that was an abomination in that day for multiple reasons. For starters, what business could a married man possibly have with a 19-year-old single woman who, at the time, was being courted by another single man who was her age? Also, Joe circumvented the social conventions of his day in sending that letter directly to Nancy. Social conventions dictated that when a man wanted to contact a woman for any purpose, he was to go through her father or her husband unless extenuating circumstances dictated otherwise. But for the purposes of courting a man's daughter, you went through the man, because his daughter was his possession until she was given to another man in marriage. At this time, Francis Higbee, son of trusted Mormon elite John Higbee of Mountain Meadows Massacre fame, was courting Nancy Rigdon. After Joe's proposition, Nancy told her boyfriend Francis Higbee about what had happened, and then it inevitably spread to John C. Reckitt Bennett, after which the story was picked up into the bloodstream of the Nauvoo rumor mill, and the story was passed around the entire community. To what extent the Rigdons were aware of Joe's sexual escapades prior to this situation between Nancy and Joe can never be known. They must have known from the earliest days in Kirtland that rumors surrounding Mormonism and polygamy were likely stemming from Joe's misconduct. D&C 101, Doctrine and Covenants 101, the monogamy revelation that was removed in the 1876 from the Brighamite Doctrine and Covenants, that was published in 1835. That was likely under the direction of Hingepin Sidney Rigdon himself to assuage those rumors about polygamy. But they had to know that funny business had happened with Fanny Alger back in 1836, right before she was quickly whisked away from town. The Rigdons had to know that Joe was a womanizer, from the smallest interactions that they had witnessed to the overt propositioning of their own daughter. Phoebe and Sidney must have known it was only a matter of time before one of their daughters would fall victim to Joe's insatiable libido. Eventually, Joe was summoned to the Rigdon house in response to this entire debacle. And the Rigdon home, of course, was just a stone's throw away from the Nauvoo homestead in which the Smiths were living at the time. Now, continuing on in Van Wagner's book, quote, Sidney and Phoebe, who had given birth to Ephraim Robinson Marks Rigdon on 9th of April, were incensed at the prophet's insolence. Convention dictated that women be addressed only through their fathers. Rigdon perceived he had been hoodwinked by friend Smith. Continuing from later. George W. Robinson wrote that when Sidney confronted Smith at the Rigdon home, the enraged father demanded an explanation of the prophet's behavior. Smith, quote, attempted to deny it at first, Robinson said, and faced Nancy down with the lie. But she told the facts with so much earnestness, and the fact of a letter being present, which he had caused to be written to her on the same subject the day after the attempt made on her virtue, that ultimately he could not withstand the testimony. He then and there acknowledged that every word of Miss Rigdon's testimony was true. Nancy's brother, Wycliffe, in recalling the situation, provides more context for Nancy's personality and how she dealt with the accusations from the prophet that she was lying about the ordeal. Wycliffe recalled the scenario as follows. Smith came to Rigdon's home and mentioned the subject and attempted to deny it. Nancy was one of those excitable women, he added, and when she heard the prophet's denials from an adjacent room, she stormed into the parlor and said, "Joseph Smith, you are telling that which is not true. You did make such a proposition to me, and you know it." Another later reminiscence described Nancy's perspective of the situation when they said, "Nancy, you are not afraid to call the Lord's anointed a cursed liar?" "No," the strong-willed girl replied, "I am not, for he does lie, and he knows it." End quote. This scenario reveals anything. It's that Nancy wasn't under Joe's spell, as the thousands of other Mormons were. Really, though, she grew up watching Joe become the prophet that he was in Nauvoo. She was 8 years old, or 9 years old, around there when they first met, and her formative years were spent in intimate settings when the prophet and Emma would take dinner with the Rigdons or have meetings in their own homes with them, whatever the case may be. They were friends. The two families were very close friends. At that time, she saw Joe as a man. Nancy had a rare perspective in that time and place of American history. She didn't have the spell cast over her. She wasn't spellbound. Beyond that, the situation between her and Joe reveals so much of the man behind the cardboard cutout prophet that we know. Nancy Rigdon and her refusal of Joe's proposition, which became incredibly public, is a tough set of facts to get past or to try and spin in a positive light that doesn't reveal Joseph Smith to be the sexual predator that he was. However, the controversial nature of this interaction hasn't stopped people from trying to spin the situation. It started early. Less than a year after Joe and Hiram died in Carthage, at the gunfight in Carthage, Orson Hyde spoke to a congregation in Liverpool, England, when questions were raised concerning what had happened between Nancy and Joe. You can immediately see the rewriting of Joe's history, when his body was still warm underground, done in a way to paint Nancy as a feckless whore in need of chastising by the perfect prophet of the Lord. This is according to Orson Hyde. Joe had asked Hyde's wife, Marinda Nancy Johnson Hyde, then plural wife of Joe's, which, we've discussed that, to set up this meeting between Nancy and Joe, but not for the purposes of propositioning her for a plural marriage. No, that doctrine was still under wraps in 1845 when this was given. This is what Orson Hyde said concerning the encounter between Joe and Nancy, and I'm reading this from Mormonism, Shadow or Reality, page 222. Quote, "The Mormon apostle Orson Hyde admitted that his wife had invited Nancy Rigdon to visit Joseph Smith, but he stated that Miss Rigdon was a wicked woman, and that Joseph Smith desired the meeting to reprove and reclaim her if possible. Will the best and most blessed people on the earth have spiritual wives and tolerate adultery?" This is, all Orson Hyde here. "During my absence to Palestine, the conduct of his daughter, Nancy, became notorious in this city. According to common rumor, she was regarded generally little if any better than a public prostitute. Joseph Smith, knowing the conduct she was guilty of, felt anxious to reprove and reclaim her if possible. He accordingly requested my wife to invite her down to her house. He wished to speak with her and show her the impropriety of being gallanted about by so many different men, many of whom were comparatively strangers to her. Her own parents could look upon it and think that it was all right, being blind to the faults of their daughter. There being so many of this kind of men visiting Mr. Rigdon's house that Mr. Smith did not care to go there to see her. Miss Nancy, I presume, considered her dignity highly insulated at the plain and sharp reproofs she received from the servant of God. She ran home and told her father that Mr. Smith wanted her for a spiritual wife, and that he employed my wife to assist him in obtaining her. This was a good time for Miss Nancy and John C. Bennett to wreak vengeance on the victim of their hatred for his severe admonitions. Miss Nancy is made, therefore, to attribute to Joseph Smith and to my wife language which neither of them ever used. Thus must an innocent and unsuspecting female suffer for putting down a hand to help, as it is verily believed, a poor miserable girl out of the very slough of prostitution." End quote. Yep. You can't trust those women, can you? Consider the source of this quote, right? Orson Hyde was a Book of Mormon thumping apostle working under the direction of Brigham Young, proselytizing to the British converts as the Mormons in Nauvoo were toiling with who to follow after the death of their supreme worldly leader. Now, at this time, in 1845, Sidney Rigdon had garnered a significant following in blatant contradiction to Bloody Brigham Young's authority claims. Hingepin Rigdon was viciously opposed to polygamy, and the meeting between Joe and Nancy likely rang the death knell for Joe and Rigdon's relationship, as we'll soon see. At this same time, Bloody Brigham was practicing polygamy behind closed doors, but with much less public concealment than Joe had ever, employed. It was fairly well known throughout Nauvoo Mormonism that Bloody Brigham and Heber the Creeper Kimball had already taken most of Joe's wives to their own name for a time, according to Levitical teachings. So the source of this version of Joe and Nancy's meeting was trying to teach legitimacy to celestial marriage under the Brighamite tradition, while at the same time casting aspersions at this strictly monogamous Rigdonite Mormonism, which was steadily gathering supporters. Now, I think it's safe to say that Orson Hyde had a vested interest in the Rigdons being painted with a certain picture at this time. His vested interests color his perspective of what he reported as had happened between Joe and Nancy. And what better way to do it than calling her a whore, right? The intent that Orson Hyde claimed Joe had in this meeting, that of rebuffing Nancy Rigdon for her supposed lack of chastity, being a prostitute in Nauvoo, a number of pieces of language were used there, that was a singular accusation made by Hyde. The historical record provides little to no precedent for establishing any factual basis for Nancy's rumored promiscuity. It just looks like it was rumors that were being passed around. Orson Hyde's accusations here were purely character assassination against Nancy Rigdon. Nancy was the victim of Joe's sexually predatory practices, yet Orson the Hyden was protecting the name of the almighty prophet and rewriting Joe's history by painting Nancy as a filthy, lying woman of the night. Amazing, isn't it? Bros protecting bros when one of them is a horrible human being. But they swore oaths with the threat of death if they didn't support one another, whether right or wrong. Nauvoo Mormonism was nothing if not the most formal-looking Bros Before Hoes club. This narrative of protecting Joe's claimed innocent character at all costs and, of course, casting aspersions and assassinating the characters of anybody who's a dissenter, that's crucial and central to the Mormon narrative. Not just Nauvoo, but the wider Mormon narrative, even as it exists today. Every point of opposition to the church or any of its actors, it's all claimed as religious persecution, and that is a crucial piece to understanding Mormon history. To capture this idea, I'm going to read another excerpt from later in the same article by Roger Lanius that I read in the beginning of today's broadcast. Quote, "How then did the misapprehension about religious persecution arise? Because there was ultimately no separation between the government and the church at Nauvoo. Non-Mormon opposition to Mormon theocratic behavior was regarded as religious persecution by Joseph Smith and his associates. Indeed, because he was a religious leader, Smith commonly characterized any criticism of him, for whatever reason, by non-Mormons or disaffected Mormons as religious persecution of a wholly innocent man. The myth of persecuted innocence was of overwhelming importance in the Mormon experience in Nauvoo, even more so than earlier. This myth is not so much fable or falsehood, I hasten to add, as it is a story, a kind of poetry about events and situations that have great significance for the people involved. Myths are, in fact, essential truths for the members of a cultural group who hold them, enact them, or perceive them. In particular, the myth of innocence, which is ubiquitous in the Mormon documents of Nauvoo period, reveals that the retreat from American religious pluralism to the theocratic separatist community of Nauvoo represented an escape from moral ambiguity, from the fear of making the wrong choices. Lanius concludes with this powerful sentence to sum everything up. Quote, as a religious city-state under tight control, Nauvoo was a haven where the followers of Joseph Smith had their most important choices, what they could do to serve God, made for them. End quote. Innocence, the persecution myth. Innocence not only of the prophet, but of the church as a whole. A collective myth, a false narrative of any wrongdoing on the prophet's part, invokes a dire need for ignoring controversial history and preserving the good name of the prophet and the institution at all costs. The situation between Nancy and Joe that we've discussed today is a horrendous set of facts to try and justify. But Orson Hyde began to do so immediately, and the character assassination plot against Nancy worked. To further illustrate that point, consider what happened in the wake of this confrontation between Nancy and Joe. Nancy continued to further depart from the church, and her character was further assailed by other protectionist Mormon elites. Later in life, she actively wrote against the church and became an outspoken enemy of brigamism. But the immediate impact of this confrontation reached beyond just Nancy and her public character. Everybody was implicated in it. Hingepin Rigdon confronting Joe explicitly about this proposition had profound negative impacts on Sidney and Joe's relationship. Joe now knew he couldn't trust Hingepin Rigdon with the fullness of the everlasting covenant of marriage, which just pushed them further apart for the remaining 2 years of Joe's life. And as evidence of this conflict, something else important happened in 1842. Remember, Joe controlled the political strings in Nauvoo. 1842 was an important election year for Illinois and the Mormons in Hancock County. They stood to get a new governor and were forced to throw their, electoral support at any elected official who would, quote, support good order, end quote, in the Mormon sense. Joseph was basically declaring the Mormons' vote. But there's also something that's not much discussed in all of this 1842 election cycle. Hingepin Rigdon was in a bid for the Illinois State Senator. He was actively campaigning to be elected to Illinois State Senate. Set to make his way through the electoral ranks in August of 1842, that was a mere 3 months after this confrontation, Rigdon's campaign fell flat. He couldn't get the Mormon vote. So Nancy Rigdon's role in the fracturing relationship between Mormon leadership, not just Joe and Hingepin Rigdon, but far broader than just those two, further complicated everything, and it stigmatized Nancy's public persona after Joe's death and the resulting schism crisis. The character assassination was swift and disturbingly effective. Even Eliza Snow piled on Nancy, using her sharp poetic prose to destroy Nancy's public standing by disparaging those who would reveal the ancient mysteries and covenants practiced by the Lord's anointed prophets throughout time immemorial. The poem's a little bit long, but it's Eliza Snow, and I simply love what this poem reveals about the culture of Nauvoo Mormonism. So we're just going to allow Eliza to take us out for the night. Published in The Wasp, 11th June, 1842, by Eliza R. Snow. The Tattler. It has been said by some that woman's soul should never hate. I know the placid wreath of gentleness is beautiful upon the female brow, and that the pure white wand of innocence by woman wielded has a salutary potency that is superior to arbitrary power. That in her bosom pity's mellow tones are more congenial to the sphere which heaven designed for her than hatred's sterner voice. I know the worth of female rectitude. It is the fairest gem upon the crest of social life, and I would not presume to step beyond the sacred halo of propriety. But yet one character I almost dare to hate, and even in this age of effeminacy, is there who would think that woman should not hate? The tattler, whose unhallowed business seems to wake up nonsense and to stir up strife. But after all, I feel my heart relax, and pity is preponderating in my breast. I pity every human form that haplessly is the receptacle of that ignoble, most detestable of every human trait, whose head is but a vacuum where thought is totally prescribed and sent a wanderer abroad, where vanity holds undisputed sway and sits enthroned ere pompous nothingness, where, if reflection chance to come, she finds no seat, no resting place, no lamp to shine upon her path, but like a traveler, when left in some dark, spacious catacomb, amid the mouldering heaps, to stumble ere. Unconscious matter, without path or guide, is lost in everlasting hopelessness. Poor brainless skull, where every idle tale, without exception, may be introduced, and meet a cordial welcome, not to be ranked with the subjects of forgetfulness, and hid with prudent secrecy away, but to be clothed in the imposing garb of seeming consequence, and ushered forth on the first breeze that is made tremulous by that untamed, destructive instrument of mischief, that dread bane of social peace and happiness, the tattler's busy tongue. Wretched propensity, and wretched the possessor of this execrable vice, whose soul, if soul is there at all, must be unto nullity so near allied as to require a microscopic power to swell it into visibility. But while the person shares my pity, if I should not hate, I surely may despise. The character, the mean propensity, 'tis falsehood's vehicle and slander's tool, to throw dark shadows over innocence and magnify misfortune into fault. It often serpentinely creeps into the sanctuary of domestic life, and with the sacred key of confidence draws out the secrets of the drawing room, and puts them on the winds of heaven afloat. I hope I never shall commit a crime of such enormous magnitude as would draw down on me an unrelenting frown of heaven that would subject me to endure the torment of the tattler's senseless buzz. I'd rather live in solitude amid the deep impervious wilds and listen to the silent speech of nature and regale my spirit with the music of the breeze. Oh, that an abler pen than mine would paint this vice in all its innate ugliness, with its deformities and hatefulness, and make it look so like its very self, that through disfellowship it may return down to the nether shades from whence it come. The Tattler by Eliza R. Snow. Huge thanks to Richard Van Wagner for the content of today's episode. Be sure to pick up a copy of Sidney Rigdon, A Portrait of Religious Excess if you can. It's an amazing book. You can check the show notes for a link, or you can Google any of Richard Van Wagner's books. He's really an amazing historian. Also, the intro song you heard for this episode was Nancy Green 2 by Gazelle. You'll find it linked in the show notes as well. We have a few new patrons to thank. It looks like we have new pledges from BongoBot. That's just delightful, BongoBot. Jeff, Michael, and also a pledge edit from a different Jeff. There's also a new pledge from Coral Krellin, and I actually got an email in from Coral that I want to briefly read here that I think is really important, that's worth addressing here. So Corin said he's re-listened to every episode now, and he's listening again between the new episodes. I especially enjoyed the recent chat with Will Bagley. Corin goes on to say, which brings some things to mind. After attending a few of the Sunstone lectures and making it a point to attend the talks by Ned Blackhawk and Forrest Kutch, I feel there is a sore lacking in coverage of Native American perspectives on Mormon history. This isn't pointed at you or any of the other presenters, but more so a challenge. I felt compelled to ask you this due to the lack of attendance at Sunstone and Forrest Kutch's presentation. He called all the attendees out, and lack of attendance thereof, for not considering the experiences of Native peoples in regards to Mormonism. The two worst massacres of both whites and Native Americans occurred in Utah, Mountain Meadows and Bear River Massacre. Each have a direct connection to Mormon history. Before you get to the Utah stage of your podcast, a request. Perhaps contact Will Bagley and have a few episodes about Native history. Not only those in Utah, but the broader Great Basin region that Mormonism has affected. I know Bagley's in touch with Forrest. He's an endless resource to reach out to, and a very open and nice man. things to consider. And so I want to say I did respond to Corin's email directly, but I wanted to respond to it on air. And also thank you for reaching out, Corin, because this is so important. The Native American perspective is painful in Mormon and American history. Now, I want everybody, if you have a chance to do this, I want you to go to Sunstone Symposium and download the sessions that were available. There's session 91, that was the opening night, Wednesday night of Sunstone. That was the one by Ned Blackhawk. And then there's also session 363, which was Forrest Kutch's presentation. I'm going to read you a couple of excerpts, a couple of quotes from Forrest's presentation, because I think it captures so much, and then I'll respond in a second. He said, quote, This is where Corin was saying that Forrest called everybody out. He said, "I should have an auditorium and I don't. This room should be full. People don't want to face the truth. You can't have an honest relationship if it's not based on truth. That's why we have a superficial relationship here in Utah between the Native people and the Mormon people." He also said at a later point in the same presentation, "It's painful to be invisible and ignored in your own homeland." He also said, "Before settlers and disease killed off our people, there were 10 to 30,000 Utes." He also says, "If you still remember suffering, then you have not healed. When it comes to Native peoples, I dare say that we have not healed. We have not healed because the stories have not been told, neither completely nor accurately." Both of these presentations are powerful, and they reveal a massive lacking in the state education system, in the history education system, federal level, in the way that we tell the history of this land before Columbianizing it, right? Before it became the District of Columbia, before it became the United States, before the conquistadors came and killed millions of people with disease and overt warfare. And Mormons played a huge role in that. I want to tell people, this is something that's been weighing on my mind heavily. How do I incorporate the Native American perspective? Because while the Mormon perspective, the Mormon history we've discussed so far, has only had, been affected in very small and ancillary ways by Native American history, what with the Mormons settling on Native American land after the natives had been removed there, thanks to Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act. They got really cheap land prices and they were squatting on that land, but the Mormons had very, 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 very little interaction with any Native Americans. So it's something that I really haven't discussed to any great extent. But I think it's important to note that I have been trying to figure out what to do here, because it's so crucial when we get to the Utah history of Mormonism. If listeners want, they can go over and listen to my appearance on The Thinking Atheist. I think the title was just Naked Mormonism, the title of the episode. But I think it's really important because I used Will Bagley's scholarship in Blood of the Prophets to describe what what Utah was before the Mormons got there. And it was populated by some 20, as Forrest said, 20 to 30,000 Native Americans when the Mormons got there. And what began was, an extermination to some extent. An extermination in the 19th century sense of, if you are not going to do what we want you to do, if you're not going to be governed by our laws or by our religion, then you are not welcome to live near us or on land that we have now proclaimed is our land that you so happen to inhabit before we got here. And I did spend a tiny bit of time talking about the Mountain Meadows Massacre on the Thinking Atheist episode, but I just referred people over to my Scathing Atheist episodes about that. But I did try and spend a fair amount of time talking about the impact of the Mormons on the Native Americans in Utah. And the people in the comment sections have taken issue with that there's not really any evidence that the Mormons genocided the Native Americans here. Well, I tend to have a different perspective, and I think genocide is not something that is necessarily easy to quantify in terms of number of people dead or percentage of people dead. I think it's much more interesting and nuanced when we discuss the cultural appropriation and the cultural genocide that happened in concurrence with the actual physical genocide of people. The Bear River Massacre, it's often touted as 250 people, as Forrest says in his Sunstone presentation, which, I'll highly recommend it again. It was session 363. It's an important presentation. He's said that he has found an account that's in the Church Historian Archives, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe it was the Utah State Archives. He said that a person counted the bodies twice and said that there was 493 people who had been killed. 493 people at this Bear River Massacre. That's abhorrent. That's the largest massacre in the entire history of Native American colonialization. That's horrible. So I'm constantly wrestling with this. And Corin, your email is very important for historians of all walks to keep in mind that the history of Utah and the history of colonializing America is disgusting and it's bloody and it's horrific. And the more we focus on that, the more we address those bloody, bloody roots, I think the more we can have a more nuanced understanding and a more healthy understanding of what the world is today and why a lot of these social and racial stigmas still invade our culture to this day, and we haven't moved past them. Because as Forrest said so perfectly, when it comes to Native people, I dare say that we have not healed. We've not healed because the stories have not been told, neither completely nor accurately. So how I want to try and do this, I've been running this through my head quite a bit here. It's going to take us, I'm not sure how long to get to the Schism Crisis, and the Schism Crisis happens at the end of 1844. It was still another 2.5 years before the Mormons actually landed in Utah in 1847, right? So almost 3 years, actually. There's a lot of history to cover in that time, but I think it should be important that I take a number of episodes prior to the Mormons landing in July of 1847 to establish a bit of the social and tribal culture that existed in the Native American culture of the Mexico territory that it was before the Mormons got there. The Great Basin area was a fascinating and very interesting area in American history before the Mormons got there. And it's going to be important to focus on Chief Walker. That's the Americanized, the Englishized version of his name, because he was kind of the most prominent social figure of the Native Americans, and discussing the various emissaries that were responsible for handling Native American affairs. Jacob Hamlin was one of the most prominent ones in his settlement in the St. George area. There are a number of other figures who played a massive role in Native American relations and in leading the Mormon militias, the Nauvoo Legion as they were known, in extermination efforts against the natives and viciously and brutally murdering and massacring them on multiple occasions on scales from, 10, 15 people all the way up to hundreds of people at a time. It's going to be messy. It's going to be ugly when we get to American history. And I will say as a preface, when we get to the Mormon period in Utah, I'm going to do my best to try and tell as holistic of a perspective of the history as I possibly can, because the chief opponent to the Mormons in Nauvoo history is the government and anti-Mormons and the Methodists. The chief opponents to the Mormons in Utah were the Native Americans. Those were to some extent their arch rivals, Brigham Young's arch nemesis. And you can't understand why so much of Utah history happened the way that it did if you don't incorporate the Native American history into it as well. So I'm going to do my best. I'm not going to do a good job of it. I have to say that right off the bat. I'm going to do the very best that I can, but I'm not going to do a good job because I'm not a Native American historian. I'm a Mormon historian. I'm a Mormon history reporter, not a Mormon historian. I'm not classically trained. I'm a history reporter, and I'm going to report on the history that I'm able to consume at the time and do my best to report that in a way that is fair and balanced and, well, the naked Mormon history, right? So Corin, thank you for your email. Thank you for raising that objection, because it is important, and it is important criticism of the vast, vast majority of Mormon historians and Mormon history reporters. So I'll do my best. So one more thing to announce to everybody. We have coming up a couple of conferences that we'll be attending. I say we as in the royal we. I, myself, Bryce, your host, I'm going to be going to the John Whitmer Historical Conference in Missouri. That is happening September 20th to September 23rd. Going to be attending with John Whitmer Conference. It's the paramount Mormon History Conference. It's not the Mormon History Association Conference. It's the one that's put on by the church or funded by the church or whatever. This is the more honest history. This is the John Whitmer Conference. This is what Sunstone was in the 1980s. And it's all about the Mormon history. And I know the invocation speech is going to be given by Richard Bushman. And a number of the talks and lectures that are being given there are, I just glanced over the schedule. Needless to say, I'm quite excited about it. So I'm going to be putting out an episode, hopefully, that I record there with some historians. We'll have to see how it all plays out. Last year when I was at the John Whitmer Conference, you guys got the Michael Marquardt, Joe Geisner, and Bill Shepard episode talking about the Council of 50 and the Hodge murders and some of the other controversial aspects of Nauvoo history after Joseph's death. You can rest assured that whatever I do record during the John Whitmer Historical Conference is going to be something important with some important Mormon historian. It's going to be a lot of fun. So I'll have that coming up also in October. This is coming up October 12th and 13th is QED, Manchester, England. This is the premier atheist and skeptic conference basically in the world. It's one of the longest running ones. It's one of the most well attended. And from everything that I've heard all the podcasters say about QED, it is the best one in the world, except for all the other ones that are the best ones in the world as well. But it's my first time going to Europe, going to be there an entire month, going to spend a couple weeks in Germany, a week in Manchester or in England, and then another week in Ireland. Going to be a lot of fun, and more details will be coming out as to what the podcast will be doing during that month. Still going to be releasing weekly episodes, still going to be releasing Patreon-only episodes every week on Monday. Just if you guys are the supporters on patreon.com/nakedmormonism, you get a whole bunch of extra content and an extra episode every single week. So that's I'll keep queuing you guys in on details. So if you happen to be in Europe, in the Manchester, England area, it'd be really cool to meet you at QED if you happen to be able to go. I have it on good authority that I will be on a Mormon panel, which they apparently have never done a panel on Mormonism, with a couple of hosts or a couple of guests that is going to be chaired by Andy Wilson of the Incredulous podcast. He's a fantastic podcast. If episodes ever come out, if new episodes ever come out, it's a fantastic podcast. Anyway, and then on Skeptic Camp, the day before the actual QED conference, I'm going to be giving a 15-minute presentation on the Quorum of Apostles and their trip out to their England, establishing the England mission in 1839 and 42 into 41, and the impact that had on American history as a whole, which plays a lot into Brigham Young taking the majority of those converts out to Utah with him. So QED is going to be awesome. John Whitmer Historical Association are going to be awesome. You can check the show notes for this episode for links to those if you care to attend, or if you're in the area and you can attend, or if you happen to have a couple weeks you can take off of work, or a weekend or two you can take off of work and make it out there. Get your tickets. They're going fast. So with all that said, I guess it's time to close it up for the evening. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as production assistant and director of social media, and Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer. Music is produced by Jason Camo from aloststateofmind.com and is used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnome Studios, LLC, copyright 2018, all rights reserved.